The Tragedy of the Christmas Tree Ship. No one on that side of the lake could understand why on earth someone would choose to go boating or scuba diving on a day like this. Being a drizzly, overcast day in late October of 1971, it was hardly the weather for any sort of recreational water sports, and they supposed there wasn't likely to be much to see on the bottom of Lake Michigan's west side that day, other than mud, and the sailing aspect certainly didn't afford the best views in those conditions either. However, unbeknownst to them, Gordon Kent Bellrichard was intent upon a purpose. With sonar and a dive light, he had set out that day to find the wreck of the Vernon, a 177-foot, 700-ton steamer that had sunk in a storm in 1887, leaving only one passenger surviving to tell the tale. He was indeed very hopeful of finding his prize, as local fishermen had told him of a location in which their nets always snagged on something large. As he sailed up and down, scanning methodically with his sonar, the boredom began to set in, when suddenly, around the place where the sailors had said, it gave an alert. He had found something. Excited, he prepared his gear and descended as quickly as he could. It appeared to be a well-preserved shipwreck, standing upright in 172 feet of water. It must be the Vernon. It must be. And then, just as Gordon was about to catch sight of his long-awaited prize, its grand silhouette gradually coming into focus, bits of rigging visible, his dive light went out. He floated for a minute or so in the darkness, annoyed. But once his eyes adjusted to the misty, murky depths of the lake, he could see well enough to get by. Perhaps a tad foolishly, he went forward without the light and began to feel around. Knowledgeable of ships as he was, Gordon quickly realized that this was not the Vernon. This was a smaller ship. It must be at least 205 tons, he thought, and hugging his way along the hull and scrabbling about around the deck, he could make out that it had 3 masts. He soon realized with incredulity what he must have found. This was far better than the Vernon, only he hadn't ever thought he would find it instead. He came back up, lay back in his boat, and whooped with delight, for he had found what was to immortalize his name. It was the wreck of the elusive Rouse Simmons. Captain Herman Scheunemann was well loved in and around Chicago, for who could fail to love the man who brings one of the principal joys of the Yuletide season, the Christmas tree? Every winter, before Christmas, he would undertake to bring felled pine trees to the waterfronts of Chicago and sell them there from his ship, the Rouse Simmons. She was by no means his first ship. He had sailed many schooners before. Also, to call her entirely his would be lying, for in truth, like most captains, he could not afford a schooner outright, and instead he held shares in the vessel. He had 1/8 share, his friend Captain Charles Nelson had another, and a rich businessman called Manners J. Bonner owned the remaining 3/4. Scheunemann was a kind and generous man who always donated a portion of his wares to the less fortunate, decorating orphanages and hospitals out of his own pocket. His wife, Barbara, and their daughters, Elsie, and the twins, Hazel and Pearl, helped to make other articles such as wreaths. They had never been rich, but they were well liked, with the local newspapers even dubbing Scheunemann Captain Santa. Sailing Lake Michigan was a difficult trade, which some might regard as having too much risk for too little reward. In 1898, a month after the birth of his twins, Herman's brother, August, had sadly passed away in a shipping accident, sailing a load of Christmas trees to Chicago on the schooner Estal. His brother's vessel had been broken up in a violent storm off the coast of Glen Coe, Illinois, with no survivors. Although Lake Michigan is a lake, it is incredibly large and prone to bad weather. It might as well be the ocean as far as a small ship in distress is concerned. Indeed, Herman had tried to make his living in other ways, but his attempt to run a saloon had failed, and he had had to file for bankruptcy. By 1912, Herman had fully taken up the mantle of his older brother, a veteran schooner master of 30 years. He considered himself in his prime, but the ship he commanded was not. The once gallant vessel was now 44 years old, battered by the elements and worn by time and heavy loads of lumber. One late November day, the 22nd of 1912 to be precise, it was time to make the late-season Christmas tree delivery before the weather got so bad that they couldn't attempt it. The Rouse Simmons had been piled high, with pine trees covering every inch of the deck, so that all the folk on the pier of Thompson, Michigan, called it a floating forest. One might say that there were rather too many to fit properly on the boat. Dark clouds gathered, but the weather didn't look too bad. So Captain Herman Scheunemann and Captain Charles Nelson set off to deliver the Christmas trees to Chicago with a crew of reliable sailors. Some say that as she set off, they saw streams of rats leaving the ship, as if prophesying its doom. Later that day, the hints of bad weather had developed into a tremendous storm, one of the biggest Lake Michigan had ever seen. Reports were coming in of vessels in distress, so many that the life-saving stations could barely keep up. The family were all worried for the Christmas tree ship. At 2:50 p.m. on November 23rd, a Coast Guard at Kewaunee Life-Saving Station, Wisconsin, ran to the station keeper, Captain Nelson Crate. A vessel had been spotted flying its flag at half-mast. It was headed south. He held up the binoculars and made a note of the particulars. Between 5 and 6 miles east-southeast, gale blowing from northwest. Captain Crate urgently requested the gas tugboat, but he found that it had already gone out on another job. After a few minutes they could not see the stricken vessel at all, so at 3:10 p.m. he phoned Two Rivers, the next station along to the south, who immediately launched their boat. However, when the lifeboat crew reached the place where the schooner should have been, they saw nothing. Nothing but water, mist, and the falling snow. Barbara and her daughters were very worried that they had heard no word of the vessel's arrival in Chicago. They still dared to hope that the vessel had merely pulled into a safe harbor to wait out the storm. The families of the crew lamented as bedraggled, needleless Christmas trees washed up on the shores in the following days. The Scheunemann family's worst fears were confirmed. The ship, source of much joy to Chicago, had been lost in the storm. What exactly happened on the Rouse Simmons that night, we shall never know. One can only imagine how the men must have struggled to right the vessel, overladen as it was. Upon proper investigation by an underwater archaeological team in 2006, the masts, anchor, chain, and spar were all found to be lying beyond the bow, leading to the assumption that the schooner had nosedived due to uneven weight distribution. The only comfort for the family was the washing up of Herman Scheunemann's oilskin-wrapped wallet in 1924. At least they had something to remember him by. Barbara and her daughters continued the business, eventually switching from schooners to taking the trees to Chicago by train, and sold them from the deck of a docked schooner for the sake of tradition. By 1920, the schooner trade on Lake Michigan was at an end. Once proud schooners lay leaking and decaying, moored in their berths around the lake. The loss of the Rouse Simmons had really sounded the death knell for Christmas tree deliveries. However, our story does not quite end there. For even now, Lake Michigan mariners claim to spot the Rouse Simmons, laden with her cargo, appearing from nowhere, and around Barbara Scheunemann's grave in Acacia Park Cemetery, it is said that one can constantly smell evergreens.